Welcome to the NNJR Trackside Classroom series. As you probably know, we have a series of classroom materials available on YouTube. And today's topic is driving at the limit. Obviously, or at least I hope it's obvious, that the target audience for this group today is advanced drivers and not necessarily beginners, although we'll say more about that, I guess, as we get into it. All right, well, let's dive right in. The first thing, as normal, is our disclaimer that says we're offering the best advice we can here, but you use it at your own judgment. And we all know that the sport that we love to do has certain risks associated with it. So today, driving at the limit. Well, let's talk a little bit about what the limit is, both for the driver and the car. And then we'll talk about how to safely approach the limit, some of the prerequisites involved. And in particular, I'm going to go through a step-by-step process that you can use if you like. But before I dive into that, I really want to highlight some really good information that Dennis Mascio shared with us a couple of years ago. And he highlighted that, yes, the car has a limit, but each of us as a driver has a limit. And it's incumbent on us to know ourselves, know yourself, and just as importantly, not to push. We don't get better, we don't get faster, we don't get smoother by pushing. And in fact, he points out that, fear is real, fear of crashing the car, fear of getting hurt, whatever it is. And you can't ignore that. You have to acknowledge it and deal with it. And he furthermore points out that this sport is an intellectual sport. And as we get better, the fear level goes down. And some tips he gave us, which I'm going to reinforce later, are to stop at each level until it's rote. In other words, it has to be consistent. We have to have a consistent baseline to get better. So if you're a beginner or a newer driver watching this, you have to have that consistent baseline before you can get better. And I've given you the link here to Dennis's talk if you want to really learn from a master a lot more about these topics. Now let's think about, before we dive into the limit, let's just talk about the fundamentals for a minute. There are really three fundamentals needed to be successful on track. And I've adapted this from Ken Hill, who's a longtime professional coach. And the first is the technique. This is the stuff we typically think about, the line, the braking technique, the braking points, and so on. And yes, that gets better with deliberate practice, both on and off track. And I'm going to spend a fair amount of time on technique related to the limit here in a minute. But what I want to point out here is that he emphasizes that that's only one of three fundamentals. The second one is our physical fitness. Perhaps we take this for granted, but if we aren't physically sharp or fit, then we're not going to be as successful. And if we get tired or our fitness is compromised in some other way, our mental focus and our ability to drive drops. So probably not a good time to be trying to improve a lot. And mental fitness. In fact, Ken points out that this is where he sees the most challenges with the drivers he works with to coach. They suffer from, it might be a lack of confidence, but it also might just be a distraction. They're so busy with their work or something going on in their life that they can't apply 100% focused, out on the track. Those are very common barriers. And here's a tip. we need a trigger to refocus our attention when it gets distracted. I think some of you probably heard Ross Bentley use the term "eyes up" as one of his triggers, but can be any word that you want to adapt. But I'm going to go ahead and talk in a minute about techniques, but I'm not going to spend much more time on physical fitness and mental fitness, but I want to emphasize them here because they really are a prerequisite. So, and a couple of other obvious things. We can't work on approaching the limit if you don't have a lot of experience, if you're chasing car setup or changes, if you aren't seated or otherwise aren't comfortable in the car. I had a situation once where, I was at VIR and I didn't have a good line of sight going up the climbing S's because of the way the seat was configured. Well, obviously I couldn't drive very well in those circumstances. I had to fix that before I could do anything else. And I've already pointed out that if you're tired or distracted, you're not going to be, very successful. And we certainly don't want to be working on finding the limit in those circumstances. So how do we get closer to the limit? Well, here's some concrete steps that will help you do that. And the first one is to write down a goal, a technique goal or goals, for an event and for each session. And I'm going to lay out those technique steps, if you will, in just a minute. I'm going to give you some and in fact, even a sequence, so you can lay those out as a goal. But most importantly, it's not a lap time goal. Notice it says technique, because to get better, to get closer to the limit, we have to get better at one or more specific skills, and the lap time will result from that. But we can't just go out and work on lap time. And then visualize what that success looks like. If the goal is to nail down wide open throttle point, a reference point for where we want to get to wide open throttle at turn 1 at Watkins Glen. And that's an example of how concrete your technique goal should be. I'll restate that because it's a very concrete example of something you may want to work on. I want to nail down, I want to get very consistent with where I'm at wide open throttle exiting turn 1 at Watkins Glen. That's a goal for a session or even for an event that you can write down. And then you can visualize what that feels like and looks like in your head, before you get to the track and while you're at the track. And that visualization, as you've heard me say before, can be very powerful. And this is going to help make you more successful. But do be realistic with the goals. Is your driving consistent enough to build on? If your approach to turn 1 or your exit to turn 1 is kind of all over the map, well, then, nailing down wide open throttle is probably not realistic. So, there has to be that baseline in order for any of this to work. If you don't have that baseline, then your goal should be, working on consistency, which would start probably with, I'll show you what it should start with on the next slide. Well, actually in 2 slides. And this just sort of restates some of that in a different way. Once you're in the car, you need to be relaxed. You need to be focused on that goal, and have that mental image of success. And you're going to try something new. You're going to, in my example, you're going to try maybe a wide open throttle point that's 5 feet earlier than what you've done before. You're going to try that, and you're going to see if it works. If it does work, great. If it doesn't work, then we know we've tried it too soon. And we want to be, when we're out there working on this, we want to be paying full attention to what the car is telling us and what the feedback is. So if we want to think about what basic consistency is, we're going to start with these key reference points. And these are ones you've all heard 1,000 times, right? You know, where I start braking, beginning of braking, turn in point, apex, track out. But Dion von Moltke, when he talked to us in the winter seminars, both for instructors and drivers, as well as in his book, he adds a very important reference point to those basic ones. And that's called the slow point in the corner. And in a minute, I'll talk about how that varies. But most corners we deal with are what are called exit speed corners. And therefore, the slow point is give or take a car length before the apex. And that figuring that out and driving with that in mind, which means that even if we turn in and we think we're going too slow, Dion says we should coast up to that slow point. You know, don't get on the gas. You know, and because the whole idea is we want to be able to get on the gas to accelerate, but we can't accelerate out of a corner until after the apex. Why? Because we can't open our hands. You know, the car's still turning in the first part of the corner. We can't accelerate until we get to and after the apex. So nailing down that slow point. So this is the consistent baseline that we need before we can move on and get faster. And you know, a couple of notes here, corner types, and he also points out that these reference points are really worked backwards. You start with the exit apex, the track out point, and that determines all of the others. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. I'll let you think about how that works. So just a little bit more on corner types. Most corners are exit speed corners, which the definition is the acceleration zone is longer than the deceleration zone. So turn one at Watkins Glen is obviously an exit speed corner, you know, because, you know, yes, there's a long braking zone, but, you know, there's a mile long acceleration zone after it or whatever the distance is up to the bus stop. And most corners at most tracks are exit speed corners. And as I've said before, the slow point's just before the apex. An entry speed corner is the reverse. The deceleration zone is longer than the acceleration zone. And often these show up followed by an exit speed corner. So an example of that is turn one, the first half of Big Bend at Lime Rock, or the bus stop at Watkins Glen. As the right hand turning in is an entry speed corner followed by a left hand exit speed corner. And on these corners, the slow point is just after the apex as opposed to before. And then there's a third type of corner, which is called balanced, where the two zones, acceleration, deceleration, are more or less equal. And Watkins Glen turn 10 is a good example of that. And you can no doubt think of some others. Those tend to look like higher speed corners as well. And here's a tip that Dion suggested highly that you do before you go to the track. Take a track map and label the corner types on the track map, and then mark the slow point for each one. Mark it before the apex on the exit speed corners, mark it after the apex on the entry speed corners. So a great tip that'll help you get ready for being consistent with those reference points. So what you've been waiting for, how do we safely find the limit? Well, let's start by picking a relatively safe corner to work on. So I've been talking about Watkins Glen turn one. That's actually a decent example of one where there's a lot of runoff. So if we do make a big mistake, there is some margin for error there. probably a better corner to experiment with than the off-camber at Watkins Glen, for example. And the other point, which is here with the note, we're not going to work on late braking or maximizing entry speed. We're going to keep those consistent and conservative at this point. What we are going to do, after we have that basic line and reference points being consistent, is we're going to play with the apex angle and find the earliest wide open throttle point that we can. This watt wide open throttle point that Dion makes the point, as have many other pros, that the difference between pro and amateur drivers isn't that the pro gets on the gas sooner necessarily. The difference is that the pro gets their foot on the floor sooner. And that's what we're trying to do here. We're going to experiment with how soon can we get our foot on the floor and still not run out of track at the track out point. And we're going to do that experimenting by playing a bit with how much do we have to have the car turned at the apex. Because obviously if it's pointed like it is in the diagram at the moment, we're not going to be able to get on the gas very soon. On the other hand, if we can point it more like this, then now we can get on the gas sooner. And part of this process is obviously where do we first get on the gas? That's what I've shown here as TAP, which is throttle application point. That is obviously a dimension that we have to work on and get figured out here, but we're focusing on the wide open throttle point. And so this step in the process is the most important one. And we're not, we're not pushing in the first half of the corner here. And in fact, it's very safe what we're doing here, right? Because if we do get on the gas, get our foot on the floor too soon, what's going to happen? Well, we're going to run wide at the track out and we can drive off. And if we're at turn 1 at Watkins Glen, that's not a big problem. So very safe, and we're building the correct technique to get the car out of the corner as fast as possible. And if we practice this a lot, well, let me say it differently. We can't move past this step in the finding the limit until we've gotten very consistent with, where is that slow point? Where is the apex? Where is our foot on the floor? And most importantly, what is the angle of the car at the apex? So this step, which is really the first step, even though it's labeled 3 here, is one I'm highlighting because this is going to take a lot of practice and deserves a lot of practice. And we have to do it till it's completely nailed before we can move on to the other steps. All right. So this is the critical process step, if you will. Now, just one note about throttle application. Exit speed corners need to have what's called an exponential throttle trace. So if you look at the throttle trace in gray here, this is me in a corner, and it's not terrible, but it's not quite as good as one of Dion's throttle traces. This is an example of an exponential throttle trace where initially on the gas, a little more, a little more, a little more, a lot more. So the idea is, we're going from no gas to foot on the floor pretty quickly, but we're not just slamming the throttle down. We do have to feed it in on a gentle basis, if you will. But the point is, it's not drug out over a very long period of time at all. If the throttle trace, has a long, slow buildup, then that's not what we want in an exit speed corner. And this should help you understand why the wide open throttle point is so important. And yes, the where you get on the gas is relevant, but we're focused on where can we be on the floor. Now, in an entry speed or balanced corner, we do not want this kind of throttle. We want a more linear, slower ramp up type of throttle. If you think about turn 10 at Watkins Glen, very fast. We're entering fast. We want to be using the gas in a much more progressive, linear fashion to keep the car balanced. So back to the steps. If we've done what I had on 2 slides ago in step 3, now we can work on the first half of the corner. So this is how that step works. Now we've nailed down the apex, the track out, the wide open throttle. Now we're going to work on V-min. We're going to work on picking up the pace at the slow point of the corner. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to keep the braking point where it was, but we're going to relax the brakes as we come into the corner, meaning we're going to come into the corner with a little more speed. We're going to roll entry speed in until one of these things happens. The slow point or V-min is too late, or we miss the apex, or we're at the wrong angle. So in other words, we're going to enter the corner faster, but we're going to do that in small steps until we screw up something that we have already nailed down, namely the angle at the apex or the apex itself. So there's a lot in this, and hard for me to emphasize probably how much discipline is required to do this. But this is the process, keeping everything in the second half of the corner the same, and working on entry speed to figure out where V-min is. Now, once one of those things happens, if we miss the apex, we miss the angle, now we have to back down a little bit, but we've all of a sudden learned what the maximum speed is at the slow point, right? That's our whole objective here is how fast can we be at the slow point of this corner. So if we practice this a lot, now we have nailed down all of the things we had before, plus the speed at the slowest point, right? So we've added just one dimension, right? We've worked on one thing in this step, and that is what's the speed we can carry at the minimum at the slow point. Notice I've said nothing about braking here. We're still braking at a conservative point. The only thing we've done is we're rolling some of that speed into the corner. So we've done less braking early in the brake zone, more later to get us to where we want to be here. And as a next step and a last step, we work on braking. So let's talk about how we work on braking. First, we have to make sure we're nailing the first part of the brake zone. And that means in a heavy brake zone, like turn 1 at Watkins Glen, it means what I've called and others have called the 1-2 on the brake pedal, meaning we get our right foot on the brake, we feel pressure, and then we press hard. And if you're driving a newer car, you need to press really hard, need to use those right leg muscles, so that the early part of the brake zone scrubs off a lot of speed. And that's the first part that anybody watching this who's a more advanced driver should be doing that already, but if you're not, it's something to really work on. Then we work on the last part. Now we're going to figure out to maintain that minimum speed that we just nailed down in the previous slide. Where do we have to come off the brakes to make that work? The EOB, the end of braking, and not just the speed, but the angle. Obviously, how we use the brakes as we're turning in here is going to affect not only our speed, but the angle of the car. And so this step is all about nailing down, that end of braking and how that affects our speed and our car angle. Once we have that done, now we're going to move the beginning of braking in a car length or less at a time until we screw up something we've already figured out. If we can't turn at our normal spot because the car is going too fast, well, then we got to brake earlier. If we get to our end of braking and we can't come off the brakes, well, we got to brake earlier, and so on. And so again, the late braking, if you will, is the last thing that we've worked on here. And as Dion has pointed out, this is a safe process. All the steps we've worked on here can be done in very tiny increments, so that we're not making, if we do quote overcook, we're overcooking at a very small level and something we can easily deal with. So to summarize, driving at the limit, learning the limit starts with the driver. That physical and mental fitness that we talked about, and then figuring out what those specific technique goals are. I've given you a whole series of steps here, and you can, obviously you want to pick them in the right sequence, but pick a technique, whether it's, the wide open throttle, EOB, whatever it is, and something to focus. But write that down and use that as a focus, and then pick a safe corner and use deliberate steps that minimize the risk, approach learning in that kind of organized, disciplined kind of way. Identifying those key reference points, optimizing wide open throttle first, and not trying to do everything with late braking, which is a common mistake that we often see. Well, with all of that said, I hope you found this useful. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to see me at the track. Feel free to send me an email at gilbert4@rcn.com. And in the meantime, I hope you have a great day. And again, I look forward to seeing you at the track.